So in this video, we're going to beef up our skills quite a bit by trying out some practice problems over graphing trig functions. But in this video specifically, I am not going to be writing out a table to help us sketch a graph. Now, you're more than welcome to make a table to plot your points, but I'm going to show you some skills that a more advanced people will do to create a cosine and sine graph. And it comes from understanding the foundational parent function for a sine and cosine graph. So let's review a little bit. When we're talking about a sine graph here, the sine graph to me looks kind of like a S-shape or a snake-shaped curve. So when I graph sine, it starts off at 0 and goes to 2 pi. So let me grab a pen here. So it starts at 0, curves up, comes back down to -1, and then goes back to 0. So it has this kind of S-shaped curve. And right here where it meets in the middle, that's where pi is. So this is very typical for a sine. It goes up, comes back down. It kind of makes a snake-like shape or an S-shaped curve. Whereas a cosine kind of looks like a U shape. So if I were to draw a quick sketch, it also goes from 1 to -1, 0 to 2 pi. But it starts actually at the top at 1, goes back down, curves back up, and stops at +1 for the y. But in the middle point here where it goes down to -1, that's where pi is. So if you can understand the basic shape of sine and cosine and understand the shifts, then you can shift the graph around however you want. And I'll show you how I do it. So first off, I understand that in part A, I have a cosine graph, so I'm going to be looking at this type of graph. I'm going to be graphing something that looks like a U. And it has a amplitude of 2 because that's 2 is a number in front, so I know my amplitude is 2. I also see that there is a vertical shift because this number is to the side of the function and it's attached with a minus sign. So I know this is a downward shift. So this is down 3. So remember, our midline usually is here at y equals 0 when we're talking about the midline. So if this is being shifted down 3, that means our midline is at -3. So y equals -3. And that helps me a lot because I'm going to use that midline as my middle ground and draw on top of it. So here's what I mean. Here's my graph. I'm going to draw. And I know that this is going to be from 0 to 2 pi. So I'm just going to half it, then half it again, pi over 2. And I know that I'm going to be shifting down to -3. So I'm going to shift all the way down to -3. I might need to extend a little bit further. I also noticed that the amplitude is 2. So from this midline, let's draw our midline here. So this is where the middle part of the graph is, at least vertically. I need to go about 2 amplitudes up and 2 amplitudes down. Remember, the original graph goes 1 amplitude up and 1 amplitude down, but we have to go 2 units. If I were to go 2 units up, that means I reach all the way to -1 would be my highest point. So -1 is going to be my highest point, but I also need to go 2 units down. So that means -5 is going to be my lowest point. Now, the next thing I need to understand is that cosine starts at its highest point. So my highest point is going to be 2 amplitudes up. So that's going to be at -1. At pi over 2, I want you to notice typically cosine is at 0 or where the midline is. So in this case, my midline is right here. So it goes back down to the midline. At pi, it's at its lowest point. So my lowest point is 2 amplitudes down the midline. So that is going to be down here. So I'm already starting to see the shape, but remember, cosine's a U. So when I'm connecting dots, I'm trying to make that U shape happen. And then 3 pi over 2, you can see it comes back to the midline here for cosine. So I'm going to try to mimic that. And then at 2 pi, it's back to the highest point. So at -1 is going to be 2 pi. So I connect the dots, and I kind of make that U shape. Mine's not as pretty. Probably it's not because it's not as good as scale. So that there is my cosine 2 cosine minus 3 function. All right, let's try some more here. So part B, again, I'm going to start us off with first identifying what type of graph that we see. So I notice we have a sine graph. So when I'm looking at my sine graph, notice that I have an S shape. And typically for sine graphs, you start at the midline here, or in this case, 0. But this one might be a little bit different. So I notice I have a -4 in front of sine. So that tells me my amplitude is positive 4, right? Because in this case, the amplitude is always in an absolute value form, or always positive. So amplitude, take the absolute value of -4, you get positive 4. The midline here, well, I notice there is a -1, so this is going to say down 1. So my midline is not at y equals 0. It's going to be shifted down 1 unit, so y equals -1. So this is enough pieces for me to kind of draw this equation. So if I were to draw this equation, I'm going, it's a little long here. Let me shorten that up a little bit. So I'm going to 0 to 2 pi, half that, 3 pi over 2. And notice that I'm still using every half a pi increment. I just prefer to do it this way, just because my original graph, I did it that way. What I need first is the midline. That helps me tremendously. And I notice my midline's at -1. So I'm going to go down 1 unit. And so I'm going to draw my midline here, which is at -1. Now, the next step I need to do is use my amplitude. My amplitude is about 4 units up and 4 units down. So I need to extend quite a bit. If I'm going 4 units down, I'm going to be at, well, -2, -3, about -4. No, -5, 4 units down, my bad. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep, just went 4 units down, so about -5. And I need to go 4 units up. So that's 1, and then that would be up to +3. I also want to mention another thing. If you notice there's a negative number here, remember that anytime you have a negative number, it flips the graph. So in this case, instead of sine starting upwards first to the maximum point, it's going to be down and then back up. So it will flip the max and mins. So instead of going up, I'm going to have to be coming down. So that's something I do need to remember when I'm graphing, if you're graphing without a table. So at 0 here, or when x is equal to 0, sine starts at the midline here. So my midline is going to be at -1. At pi over 2, I typically am at my maximum point at pi over 2 on a normal sine graph. But for me, because this is a negative in front of the 4, I know that it flips. So instead of being up here at +3, I need to be down in the lowest part of my graph. So 3 is my highest point, -5 is my lowest point. So that's my minimum point. And then after that, it goes back to the midline on a normal sine graph. So I need to go back to my midline when I get back to pi. And then at 3 pi over 2, I should be hitting my maximum point. That would be the next part of the pattern. And then back to my midline for 2 pi. So I went down to -5, back up to my midline, which is my vertical shift at -1 for y, and then back on up, and then back on down to my midline. All right, and there is my sine graph. Let's try out the cosine graph now. So this cosine has a fraction in front of it. It's 3 over 4. But whatever it is, that is still going to be the amplitude. So my amplitude here is at 3/4. And notice that this cosine does not have a plus or a minus sign next to it. So there's no vertical shift. That tells me my midline is still at y equals 0. So that's kind of nice. This one might be a little bit easier to graph because there's no flipping, right? There's not a negative sign in front of this cosine. If I have a cosine, that means that I have a U-shape graph here. So I'm going to be graphing something like this. And so if I were to do that, let me see if I can blow this up just a little bit. So let's start with graphing a coordinate. So I have 0 to 2 pi, and then I'll just half it. So because I have 3/4, I'm just going to go maybe by halves, just make it a little bit easier. So I have 0.5 to 1 and negative 0.5 to negative 1, just so I can do the 3/4. My midline is at 0 because I have no shifts. So this is my midline, the x-axis. And so this one, again, I'm using cosine, so I need to make that U shape. And so when I'm starting at 0, I should be at my highest point. My highest point is my amplitude. So in this case, I'm going to 3/4, which would be right about here at 0. At pi over 2, typically it goes back down to 0. And then at pi, for cosine, it's the lowest point. So this is going to be at whatever the amplitude is. So in this case, it goes all the way down to negative 3/4. So about right here. So between 0.5 and negative 1. So about negative 3/4. Let me dip down a little bit more than that. And then for 3 pi over 2, it goes back up. And then for 2 pi, we go back up to positive 3/4. So when I connect the dots, I should be able to make that U-shaped curve again. And let's take a look and compare it to our cosine graph that's above here. So notice the difference between this one and this one. This one goes only goes up to 3/4, just because the amplitude is that much, whereas this amplitude is a 1. So it goes all the way up to 1, and the lowest that it goes is negative 1. Whereas the lowest that this one goes is 0.75 or 3/4. And everything else is still the same. It goes from, x equals 0 to pi over 2 is where it's sitting on the x-axis, kind of like here. And at pi, it's the lowest point. At 3/4, it's back at the x-axis or the midline, and then back up to the maximum spot, kind of like up here. All right, so now that we've tried out some graphing, I want us to try out some problems where we look at some graphs and then identify what could be a possible trig function that could represent the graphs. So this is where I want you guys to try to identify, what type of graph do we have? Is it sine? Is it cosine? Do you see a vertical shift? Do you notice the amplitude? These are questions that I want you to learn how to do. So for part A here, the first thing I notice is that we kind of have this bell-shaped curve. But if I had to choose whether this looks like a cosine curve or a sine curve, I would probably choose cosine. Because it kind of seems like that U-shaped curve, only it's upside down. And so when I look at cosine, let's shrink this down just a bit so we can see what cosine looks like above. So here's cosine. And notice cosine is kind of like this bell-shaped curve, but this one is inverted or upside down. So that tells me that this is probably a negative cosine because it is upside down. So I'm going to write that here. Let's see if I can fix that and straighten that up. So I have a negative cosine function. And when I look at this, I'm going to check the amplitude to see if there's anything shifted. It does look like the midline here is at 0 because that is about 1 unit from the x-axis, which could be the possible midline, is y equals 0. So we have an amplitude of 1. And I notice down here it's from 0 to -1. So that looks like an amplitude of 1 as well. So the amplitude looks like it's 1. It definitely looks like it's flipped, so it's a -1. There doesn't seem like a vertical shift here. So I think this equation is y equals negative cosine x would be a good fit. Let's move on to the next equation. So for part B here, this definitely looks like a sine graph. Notice that snake-like shape or that S curve. I also noticed that instead of it being at +1 for the maximum, it looks like it's been shifted down. So I do notice a vertical shift. Now, it does show the maximum first and then the minimum, so I don't think this is a negative sign, but I do think this is a sine graph, so I'm going to write sine first. It seems like the midline is down here, right? Because in this case, this looks like about where the amplitude is the same length as down here. So if I were to draw a midline, that would make the shape or divide the shape evenly. So the midline looks like it's at -1. So that tells me it's been subtracted by 1 to shift it down. And it looks like the amplitude from the midline, from the max and from the min is about 1 unit. Since that's -1 to 0, it's about 1 unit. So this should be a 1 in front, or you don't have to write a 1 since it's redundant. But it looks like our graph is y equals sine x minus 1. All right, let's try out C here. So for C, I definitely notice a shift because it's being, pulled upwards or shifted up. I also notice it's a U shape, so I have a cosine. Now this cosine looks like a normal U shape. It's not upside down or anything, so I have just a normal cosine. If I had to choose where to divide the graph to see the midline, I would say it's about here. Y equals 2, because that is about the same length from the min to the midline and the midline to the max. So it looks like my amplitude here is about 1 unit. That looks like 1 unit as well. So this would just be a 1. But my midline here has been shifted up to +2. So this needs a +2 to the side. So we have an equation that looks like y equals cosine +2. And that's it for this video. Bye, guys.